Hill.
Well, just this point that I've mentioned a couple of times today, that when you combine this competitive regulatory framework, the best on the globe, given our size of market, rule of law, and you combine that with, I think, a successful approach. I'm more optimistic than my friend from California that Mrs. Waters and Mr. McHenry will find a good spot on a payment stablecoin legislation. That is a digital token payment to be used on a blockchain that's backed by bank deposits or 90-day treasury bills or something equally sound, and that will, in my view, make America even more competitive as it relates to the reserve currency, because you'll see people use the payment stablecoin that's dollar-backed as a part of both commercial and consumer transactions in and outside the United States. Yield back to the gentleman.
Thank you. It is great to see this legislation brought forward today that supports continued U.S. leadership in digital assets, that protects this growing and innovative sector from bad actors, and ends a regulatory turf war that has for years jeopardized sound, innovative growth. Regarding the CBDC Anti-Surveillance State Act, as a co-sponsor of this legislation, I strongly support prohibiting the Federal Reserve from pursuing a path that jeopardizes the privacy rights of American citizens. We have far too many infringements on American citizens' privacy. Representative Hill, we often associate central bank digital currencies with authoritarian regimes. However, we've recently seen Western governments like Canada use their power to shut down political protesters' access to their own bank accounts. Given the lessons that we're seeing from other nations that push for a central bank digital currency early or repressed freedoms of individuals, can you remind us why this legislation is just so important?
Well, the concern is it permissionless, and is it treated like cash, and does it provide that kind of independent capability of an American citizen like we have now? So my view is that a retail-based CBDC limits people's privacy, and that's a real risk. It's not permissionless, and it could be used for government control. I'm not arguing that it would be, but I'm arguing it could be, and that's why I think Congress should prohibit this without strict authority by the Article I branch of government, the Congress. And I would add one comment about the developed world. You referenced large economies. Last summer, I met with the team of people working at the Bank of England in London who have done the research and the analytic work on a CBDC for the pound. And that's, as you know, a nation of about 40 million people, our great ally, the United Kingdom. But when they published in their equivalent of the Federal Register this idea of what they might do, they got 50,000 comment letters in a society of 40 million. I thought that was quite large, mostly in opposition. They too share the concern about permissionless. They share about the privacy concerns there. So as I say, there may be well over 100 countries doing it, but I don't see over 100 countries studying it, I should say, but I don't see countries actually implementing it for the concerns that we're expressing today before this panel. I yield back to
Will the gentleman yield?
Yeah, certainly.
Thank you very much. 170 countries. My concern is, why should we close off any discussion? Why should we stop the Fed from doing the analyzing and the investigation when all of the other countries of the world are basically moving forward? I am not saying that once this work is done, that somehow we know what the answers are going to be, that it's already been decided. What I'm saying is we are more innovative, we are more creative, we are more futuristic than to have a ban on even a pilot program that's being done by your central bank. It just doesn't make good sense for the legislative arm of the United States of America to start to stop the central bank from exploring and trying to determine what and how we are going to do it. That's all. And I yield back.
Thank you very much. I think, I really appreciate, your insight and the testimony here from Representative Johnson, Representative Hill, and I couldn't agree with French Hill anymore I think it's always been an absurd idea to think that certain rights and freedoms would be under threat until they actually are. And Americans are sick and tired of being spied on. And under President Biden, the American people are left wondering if they'll be able to purchase a gas stove or if they can do what they wish with their own private land because there happens to be a tiny stream running through it. We cannot take for granted our rights as American citizens, especially when you have an administration that has weaponized our federal agencies against the freedoms of individuals, as this one has for the last 4 years. So I strongly support the legislation before us today, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks, and gentlemen. Gentleman yields back. Seeing no other members wishing to ask questions, I do have one observation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd also like to thank my colleague on the Rules Committee, Representative Roy, for leading this legislation, the SAVE Act. As a member of Congress from one of the states that has recently attempted to allow non-citizens to vote in our local elections and has simultaneously pursued sanctuary policies that have led to a flood of illegal immigration, I am very proud to be a co-sponsor of this bill that seeks to protect a key institution of our democratic system amid an unprecedented crisis on our southern and our northern borders. Our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, however, don't seem to care about the real and the documented threat facing the security of our elections here. They will say, and they have said, that the number of illegal aliens who have attempted to vote in our federal elections is small compared to vote totals. But Chairman Stile, in your view, how high do the numbers of non-citizens illegally voting or attempting to vote in our elections have to get in order for Congress to take action? Is there some kind of magic threshold?
There's no magic threshold, and I would note that we have done a series of hearings that have shown where non-citizens have voted in numbers that could have a significant impact or determinative impact on federal elections.
Yeah, I mean, the radicals in the New York City Council tried to pass a bill that would allow a separate set of books for non-federal elections versus federal elections, and it was struck down as unconstitutional in New York State courts under the New York State Constitution. But I agree with you. The acceptable threshold for non-citizen voting in our federal, our state, and our local elections should just be 0, period, end of story. This is a right and privilege of American citizens, and it should be protected as such. And Chairman Stile, isn't it true that we can't trust the Department of Justice to go after non-citizen voting or even to try to address the problem of non-citizen voting?
They've shown no prioritization of citizenship and non-citizenship voting.
And I think that should be incredibly troubling, given the fact that we have like 10 million people here illegally wandering around the country right now, all over the United States. It's a 50-state problem. It's especially a problem in my home state of New York, and I just boggles my mind that this isn't something that we can pass on a suspension to safeguard our votes for only citizens of the United States of America. But I completely agree with you. If the Biden White House isn't even willing to say that there's a problem, how can we trust the DOJ that they're even going to do anything about it? I strongly support this legislation before us today. It's a simple, straightforward measure that the vast majority, 3/4 in fact, of Americans support as well. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Langworthy for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Since day one of the Biden-Harris administration, Americans have seen an all-out attack on consumer choice. Whether it be the appliances that we buy or the cars that we drive, the Biden and Harris administration has forgotten about the everyday Americans and instead has catered to a radical left-wing environmental cult by choosing winners and losers in consumer markets. Mr. DeVores, would you agree with this characterization?
Well, certainly Mrs. DeVore would agree with that characterization, given the low quality and the unusual characteristics of some of the low energy appliances we've been forced to purchase, many of which seem to soon fail and take frequently considerably longer to accomplish their tasks in the name of nominal energy savings. Yes, sir.
Well, very good. Look no further than the efforts to mandate, as you said, the types of household appliances that everyday Americans can purchase. I think, my family's on our 4th washing machine in about 10 years. We saw attacks on dishwashers, on shower heads, gas stoves, furnaces, and several other appliances necessary for our everyday lives. Mrs. Anwaka, do you believe that these mandates have contributed to the findings of data reported on by the New York Post in July, where 73% of Americans reported that their utility bills strain their finances, and 1 in 10 said that they would borrow money from friends or families to cover costs?
Thank you for your question. I think absolutely there's an increase in utility cost, and obviously if you're able to afford these new energy efficient appliances, maybe that is contributing, but overall their utility bills are up, and so I think we're increasingly seeing a lot of families who are making, as I mentioned, that heat or eat existential choice.
It's a very unfair choice for our hardworking taxpayers. Onto electric vehicles. Now, not only has the Biden and Harris administration catered to the radical environmentalists on appliances, it's also chosen winners and losers in what was once America's most prosperous industry, the auto industry. Despite prices at the pump reaching record new highs and surpassing an average of $3 a gallon anywhere in the country for over 1,000 consecutive days, gas-powered cars remain a more affordable option for most consumers compared to their electric counterparts. Yet the Biden and Harris administration doesn't seem to care about affordability or practicality, for that matter. Unelected bureaucrats in the administration have levied several mandates, like the EPA's tailpipe emission final rule that favors the electric vehicle industry and requires Americans to drive electric vehicles. Mr. DeVore, according to Kelley Blue Book, an average electric vehicle costs nearly $57,000 on average. Do you believe that the average American family can afford this in our current economy?
Well, no, sir, they can't. And imagine how much more it would be once the subsidies were removed, including some of the imputed subsidies, for example, with the CAFE standards that benefit EVs considerably beyond their actual fuel efficiency. If these are accounted for, the federal supports for EVs are currently averaging about almost $50,000 per vehicle. And then there's a further challenge with that. If you look at the Inflation Reduction Act spending, one of the huge areas that was not considered in all of that government spending is the infrastructure requirements to electrify our economy. So, for example, those little cans that are in your neighborhood, the small transformers that feed your neighborhood electricity, well, those are insufficiently sized if several of your neighbors buy EVs and they come home and plug them in all at once. Those small transformers in your neighborhood are going to be overmatched. They're going to either fail or the circuit breakers will trip. If you then look throughout the economy and look at the large high voltage transformers, by the way, the majority of those are imported, the plurality of which come from the People's Republic of China. You can't even get new major transformers, the high voltage kind, for 36 to 48 months. That's the current backlog to get them. So the challenge, if you look at all of these costs that were not included, we're looking at $2.4 to $4 trillion of additional costs for things like rapid chargers, a charger network on our freeways, and neighborhood infrastructure increases. And, sir, that's not even including efforts to shift home heating from natural gas to electricity.
Well, you are really on the same page as what I'm hearing from my constituents in upstate New York, and we've had significant strain economically, and with a government picking winners and losers and choosing a mass electrification mandate like in my home state of New York, it has put our future in peril, and that's why so many people are choosing to vote with their feet and move to states where they have more personal and economic freedom. But, in terms of a federal administration, we're seeing, what is happening in our dark blue states happening to our whole country. So it's in the American people's hands this November. But I thank you for your testimony. I'm out of time, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Langworthy. The chair now recognizes my friend from New Mexico, Ms. Stansberry.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman and recognizes the gentleman from New York for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be very brief. I think there's a lot of people in this country who need a reminder as to who started this war and the manner in which it started. And on October 7th, it was Hamas, not Israel, that launched the horrifying terror attack that took thousands of lives and innocent people hostage. It was Hamas, not Israel, who murdered approximately 1,200 people, including Holocaust survivors, the elderly, babies, and young, beautiful people attending a music festival. It was Hamas to this day who holds over 100 people hostage, including American citizens that continue to sit in tunnels, and we have no answers. The calls for Israel to commit a ceasefire are nothing more than asking our closest friend and ally in the face of an enemy calling for its extermination to stand down and to no longer defend itself. I think many of my colleagues on this side of the aisle would agree with me when I say I am done hearing arguments of false equivalency about the war of self-defense Israel is fighting against a terrorist organization. This is the time to stand with Israel, stand with the Jewish people, not try to cut their legs out from under them, and let them finish Hamas the way that they need to finish this war, and against the hysteria of the morally bankrupt protesters that have occupied college campuses and public spaces in support of a known murderous terrorist entity. So thank you again, Chairman McCall, for being here, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, will try to be brief, but I want to associate my comments with Mr. Langworthy's, especially about the 128 hostage. It bothers me that
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Glad it's so quiet in here. On the first day of the Biden presidency, then Press Secretary Jen Psaki claimed that President Biden's objective and his commitment was to bring, quote, transparency and truth back to government, to share the truth even when it's hard to hear. That is obviously laughable, just about as laughable as when Hunter Biden claimed that he was trying to avoid wire fees when he had Rob Walker launder a $1 million payment from a Chinese company through 16 different bank wires to Hunter, Hallie, and Jim Biden's accounts. If you're trying to avoid wire fees, then why send 4 different wires over 3 months to the same account? It's a total joke. A glaring example of President Biden's failure to live up to his promise to bring transparency is his influence peddling in Ukraine, where he pressured the Ukrainian government to fire Prosecutor General Viktor Shokin, who was investigating the owner of Burisma. While Joe Biden was vice president in 2014, his son Hunter Biden was asked by Burisma's owners to join the board, a paid position. The committee has sought documents from the administration regarding Vice President Biden's influence peddling in the Ukraine. The administration, which claims transparency, has failed to produce these documents. I'll give you an example. On September of 2015, the United States was steadfast in its belief that the owner of Burisma was the face of corruption in Ukraine. The administration vowed to work with the Prosecutor General to tackle corruption in the country. However, that all changed after a phone call from Hunter Biden and the owner of Burisma to Hunter's Washington, D.C. associates in 2015. A few days later, Vice President Biden delivered a speech to the Ukrainian legislature and privately pressured the Ukrainian president to fire the Prosecutor General. The Oversight Committee has asked the White House for drafts of Vice President Biden's speech to the Ukrainian legislature from 2015. They have withheld those draft speeches for nearly 7 months. To this date, we have not been able to review them. We all want to know whether there were edits to the speech after Hunter called D.C. We all want to know whether the then vice president, changed course to protect his son and his corrupt business associates. We all want to know whether the Biden family's business dealings affected American policy towards the Ukraine. The White House claims to be committed to bringing truth and transparency to government. It just seems like it's only interested when it's convenient for his administration. Now, Mr. Bobulinski, did Hunter ever tell you at any point the value of the Burisma income to him?
I was not involved in Burisma. I don't recall him ever mentioning that to me.
Okay, did he ever say it was his only income at that time?
Oh, okay. Actually, I stand corrected. There's a text message. I never discussed it with him. I was in Monaco at the Grand Prix. He was in Monaco for the Burisma board meeting. He set up a meeting with me. He didn't show up at that meeting. Obviously, you can imagine I wasn't too happy. And he responded to a text me asking him what's going on. And in that text, he states he's on the back of Kola's yacht fighting for the only income he has, but it wasn't from Burisma, it was from the Kazakh deal that he's talking about. I never discussed that with him after that. That was a single exchange between him and I.
No. Corruption and a lack of transparency from the Biden family have been common themes through the House Oversight Committee's investigation. And even when asking for simple drafts of then Vice President Biden's speech in the Ukraine, the White House has been anything but transparent. President Biden has done and will continue to do everything in his power to cover up the truth, especially when it's hard to hear. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Bobulinski yields back to me for 1 minute. Is there anything that you want to respond to? No, you don't worry about Mr. Goldman. We don't pay any attention to Mr. Goldman either. But is there anything that anyone said up here that you want to take about 55 seconds to respond to?
It's tempting. I mean, my biggest appeal to everyone in this room is I wish you would spend the time focusing on the fact that the Chinese Communist Party infiltrated the White House of the United States of America through the Biden family. I don't say that lightly. It's not a joke. I was willing to die for this country, as was my father and both my grandfathers and my brother. This is serious, serious stuff. We should be asking how that happened. Take the Biden name and the Biden family completely out of it. How did the Chinese Communist Party infiltrate the White House of the United States of America? Let's start there, focus on those facts, what they did, how they did it, why they used money, why they used private enterprises instead of military stuff and other stuff. That is huge to our national security. So I appreciate you yielding that time to me, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, and I'll just say this. Mr. Tlaib and Ms. Presley criticized the investors. Mr. Langworthy from New York.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate you bringing this hearing forward with a subpoena. Director, yesterday I made the decision to get in my car and drive to Butler, Pennsylvania in preparation for this moment and asking you questions about the events of the assassination attempt on President Trump's life. I've done several presidential events prior in my career, and I wanted to see this site with my own two eyes because I don't believe the video footage tells the whole story or looking at things on a diagram. And I was absolutely appalled when I went to the site, when I saw the fact that I could have stood on the roof of that building, the AGR building, and hit that podium with a 9-iron, and I'm a lousy golfer. And the fact that that was not included in the perimeter is a complete dereliction of the duty of the U.S. Secret Service. I mean, there are very few rooftops that needed to be secured, and the fact that the Secret Service, as they were putting a site plan in place, did not think it was necessary to man those rooftops, you have completely walked away from your duties. You had one job, and that's to protect the future President of the United States or to protect all of the other protectees. And President Trump is only here today by God's grace because he had just something in him that made him turn his head just slightly, or we would be in a national period of mourning right now. And you have done nothing here today. I've rewritten these questions like 4 times during your hearing, and you haven't answered a damn one of them. You haven't given any information. You have hidden behind this FBI investigation, and I think you should be ashamed of yourself because you have brought more shame to your agency than I think that the assassination attempt has at this point. This is literally the worst performance I have ever seen in front of a congressional hearing. You have offered no reason for this committee, this body, or the American people to trust you or the Secret Service today. And you should resign. You have said that you've put new security measures in place after the assassination attempt. Can you tell us what those are? Because the American people want to know that you're taking real corrective measures. But today you've pointed to an investigation. Investigation or not, you still have a job to do with a zero-fail mission. But so far, there's been absolutely no accountability, and you've admitted that here today. Not one person's been suspended. Not one person's been put on a desk. Meanwhile, we've got the most contentious of elections in our nation's history, and protectees are in danger because of incompetent leadership. Not the agents. The agents piled on President Trump to protect his life. Those are heroes. But the administrators running your agency, they're not right now. They're not doing their jobs, and you certainly aren't doing. The most appalling part of Saturday's events is the countless opportunities that Secret Service had to stop Crooks before he even got on the roof. At 3 o'clock, Crooks raised suspicion by entering the rally with a rangefinder. At 5:45, a cop with a Beaver County Emergency Services unit saw Crooks eyeballing the roof at the AGR International Building. And then at 5:55, Secret Service was warned of a suspicious person and identifies Crooks as a threat. This was all before shots were fired 15 minutes later. Director, yes or no, did local law enforcement alert the Secret Service about Crooks' presence at the rally?
Yes, they did.
The shooter came to attention of law enforcement almost an hour before President Trump went on stage. Law enforcement alerted the Secret Service of the shooter. Over and over, you've said there's a difference between a suspicious individual and a threatening individual. Can you explain what the shooter needed to exemplify to be called a threat?
So I'm not clear as to what identified him as suspicious to the individuals who originally clarified him that way. For the Secret Service, for an individual to be determined to be a threat, that individual would have to be seen with a weapon or capable of doing some sort of harm to our protectees.
I mean, Director, an individual walking into a rally with a rangefinder, scoping out an unprotected rooftop, and he reportedly flew a drone over hours before. It sounds like a lot more than suspicious, especially at a presidential rally. Your operational lapses, your resource management, and poor judgment nearly resulted in the assassination of President Trump. I mean, the dereliction of duty here is just appalling. The fact that you haven't visited Butler is just maddening to me. That you're not taking this job seriously. Many people here have called for your resignation. I've introduced a resolution here into this body that hopefully will get a vote this week calling on the president to fire you, ma'am. You have not done your job. You have put two black eyes on your agency, and you need to go. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Burleson from Missouri. Chair now recognizes Mr. Langworthy from New York.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the administrator being here with us today, and I'd like to discuss the EPA's recent final rule entitled Standards of Performance for New, Reconstructed, and Modified Sources and Emissions Guidelines for Existing Sources, Oil and Natural Gas Sector Climate Review. It's no secret that the final rule will have a severe impact on more than 700,000 marginal oil and gas wells throughout the United States, including wells operated by small-scale operators in my own district in the southern tier of New York. Administrator, prior rules acknowledge the need for accommodations for marginal wells. This rule should have done the same. Did EPA consider the vast differences between a marginal well operation and high-volume well operations when crafting this rule?
Yes, we did.
Okay. And now under this rule, the EPA is providing no more than a 36-month regulatory compliance timeline for the oil and gas operators. Administrator Reagan, you know as well as I do that the small-scale, family-owned marginal well operators will be seriously stretched in their ability to meet the new tranche of requirements that your agency's meeting out for them under this requirement. Have you considered extending the timeline to at least accommodate the smaller well operators who, as you know, operate with fewer resources at their disposal?
I believe that has been up for discussion, and we'll circle with you to see where that conversation lands.
Okay, that would be very helpful. Look, I've had some very frank conversations with the oil and gas operators in my district, and these are all on the smaller scale, often family-owned operations, and they provide crucial employment and economic activity in the southern tier, as well as contribute to our nation's energy needs. 20 years ago, the federal and state regulatory burden facing these operators could fit in a small packet of paper. Today, it's practically a phone book. Is with much of what the EPA has done under this and former administrators to hamstring our energy producers, this rulemaking is unacceptable. But I want to shift topics and briefly discuss EPA's recent greenhouse gas emission standards for heavy-duty vehicles, the Phase 3 final rule. Heavy vehicles included in this rule serve dual purposes through the winter season in the Northeast. Many snowplows fall under this. In fact, it was the New York City Department of Sanitation who purchased several electric trucks to serve double duty as garbage trucks and snow removal plows, and the result is that they were removed from the street very quickly. The commissioner of the New York City Department of Sanitation said during a city council hearing in November of '22 that we need them to go 12 hours a day So I don't see today, given the current state of technology, that a path forward to fully electrifying the rear loader portion of the fleet by 2040. Administrator, New York City's electric snowplow experiment failed, yet the EPA has continued to enforce several rules for vehicles that service snowplows in the winter. How do you expect plow operators in a place like Buffalo, New York, to remove 8 feet of snow during our next major disaster if electric snowplows can't last more than 3 hours with a foot of snow?
Well, I think that we have taken into consideration when and where and how these vehicles perform the best. And I think as these technologies continue to evolve, we'll see these technologies expand in areas that, quite frankly, they're seeing some challenges now. When we looked at this rule nationally, and we looked at the opportunities and talked with the OEMs, they gave us assurances that these vehicles could perform for their customers, which is why many of them stood with us when we issued the rule.
Yeah, you're using technological wish list that doesn't exist. In severe weather places like what I represent in Buffalo, New York, and the surrounding areas have much higher snowfalls than others. And to meet these guidelines is just completely unrealistic given today's technology. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to finish by saying this. The EPA has claimed over and over that its policies are in line with the original bipartisan mission of the agency. However, I don't believe that could be further from the truth. Under the direction of your department, Administrator, you've cost the American people trillions of dollars. You've hurt small businesses, and you've put the lives of millions of Americans in jeopardy, all in the name of climate virtue signaling. And we see it with the onslaught of regulations that have been handed down, affecting everyone from oil and gas operators to small and medium-sized communities just looking to remove snow from their streets to keep their public safe. I look forward to working with my colleagues on this committee to continue to push for greater accountability for these absurd policy priorities of your agency. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back.
Here at the beginning of this hearing, Hunter Biden strutting in here like a real tough guy, while he refused to sit for a deposition that he'd been lawfully subpoenaed to do. It must be embarrassing to have to defend all of this, and we certainly have Trump derangement syndrome on display in a big way in this chamber today. Over the last year, the Oversight Committee has uncovered a plethora of evidence that is directly pointing at the corruption from Joe Biden and his family. This level of corruption is what you'd expect to see in a third world country, not the United States of America. If the volume of evidence was uncovered on any other influential family in the United States, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle would no doubt initiate thorough investigations. Now, just imagine if Hunter was a Republican. The president's son does not deserve special treatment, period. Holding Hunter Biden in contempt of Congress is the responsible reaction to his blatant disregard for federal law and our duty to investigate potential wrongdoings by the President of the United States. This committee has analyzed thousands of pages of bank records, leading to the discovery of $24 million of wire transfers and payments from foreign companies and foreign nationals directly to this Biden family. Through interviews with Biden family closest associates, the committee discovered that Hunter Biden used his father's name and influence in meetings with foreign nationals over 20 times. Witness testimonies proved that Hunter Biden dined with foreign individuals from countries such as Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan alongside his father, who is the sitting vice president of the United States. And the list of evidence goes on and on. The president himself has been exposed for lying. Both the White House and Hunter have used every tool at their disposal to obstruct this investigation and to block the gathering of evidence. This blatant corruption must be held to account. It's one of the major duties of this very committee. And that's why on September 12, 2023, as a result of the significant evidence against the current president, the Speaker of the House asked the Oversight Committee to conduct an inquiry to determine whether or not sufficient grounds existed for the impeachment of President Biden. Hunter Biden's testimony is a critical component of the impeachment inquiry into whether President Biden or his family personally profited from his office as vice president or his current role as president of the United States. And these facts cannot get in the way. We have got to get on with this investigation and end the distractions that we've heard here today. Let's get this contempt provision put forward and let's move forward with this impeachment inquiry.
Will the gentleman yield? Will the gentleman yield?
Mr. Gosar, as is Mr. Langworthy from New York.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Criswell, the reports of this FEMA employee directing volunteers to bypass properties of Trump supporters is an absolutely disgusting affront to the mission of FEMA and the trust of the American people in all of their federal government. FEMA exists to serve all Americans at times in their darkest hours and their times of crisis. And this has got to be delivered without bias or favoritism or despite any level of discrimination. Yet here we are discussing allegations that there was political discrimination tainting FEMA's response. I mean, I really appreciate you being as forthright as you've been today, but after Hurricanes Helene and Milton, countless Americans lost their homes, their businesses, and their livelihoods. Their worlds were turned upside down, and FEMA should have been the lifeline. It should be a beacon of hope for any community that has been ravaged by disaster. And if this situation was flipped and this was happening to those that supported Kamala Harris, the outrage across this country would have been deafening. You know, the media would have been going crazy. Yet, we didn't have that same level of outrage. This is symptomatic of a dangerous and growing culture of bias throughout this entire federal government. And I would hope that FEMA would be the last agency to ever contribute to that, because you truly are dealing with American citizens at their darkest hour. We need to be about Americans helping Americans, period. End of story. No matter, you know, where you are, where you come from, or who you support for President of the United States. When disaster response has been corrupted by political bias and gamesmanship, the American public's faith in this federal government gets broken permanently. And it's really tough to erase that stain. So I take you at face value that, you know, you're a person of action, you want to fix this. But what bothers me is how this employee got to this moment and what culture existed around them where they thought it was okay to guide other employees to say, no, skip those houses. I mean, are you aware of any of your employees that felt that Trump supporters were dangerous to approach their homes? I mean, what was, in your initial portions of your investigation, you're leading to the determination of this employee. I mean, what was it that, you know, she expressed as to why we would avoid these Trump households?
I can't speak to the motivations that drove her to send that message, but the actions that she took were completely unacceptable. We have initiated ongoing investigations, and if we find any further evidence that this is broader than this incident, then we will take appropriate action.
I mean, since you've been at FEMA, has political affiliation ever been classified by FEMA or any other federal agency, to your knowledge, as a dangerous community trend?
Never.
Okay. Did your employees and volunteers go to properties with any signage or flags or memorabilia supporting Kamala Harris or any other of the Democratic candidates running for office across the country?
Other than the information that I have from this one incident, we have gone to tens of thousands of homes across all 6 states impacted.
So yes or no, are you aware of any directive from supervisors at FEMA to avoid properties with any Democratic or Republican signage, for that matter?
I have given no evidence, and I am not aware at this time.
Okay. I think that this investigation is really important, that you're on, and I'm really going to be looking for a keen interest to the final product, you know, as you finish that product. Any timeline is when that investigation might conclude?
We have reached out to the Inspector General to conduct the investigation. I can't speak to what their timeline will be.
I think it's really important to restore faith for all Americans in many parts of the federal government, but FEMA in particular. So I really look forward to hearing, you know, from you more in the future. In my remaining time, I'd like to quickly revisit a letter that I sent earlier this year urging FEMA to update its methodology for snowstorm-related reimbursements. In its response, FEMA stated that it's working with NOAA on potential updates. And as winter approaches, lake effect snow season in Buffalo, New York is coming. It's crucial that to my constituents in Western New York that we know that FEMA is taking proactive steps to ensure the most current standards guide federal assistance decisions. Can you give an update on any progress FEMA and NOAA have made in their efforts to modernize its methodology?
I know following the historic snow season that we've had last year and previous years, our teams have been working on that, but I would have to get back to you specifically as to where that's at.
Okay, we look forward to following up. Thank you very much, Director, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. Langworthy from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Califf, my constituents, many of whom don't have the same access to a doctor's office as my colleagues in urban or sprawling suburban areas often do, they're the ones most impacted by the FDA's inaction and lack of clarity on prescription to over-the-counter, or in other words, RX to OTC switch. What this can often result in is a lack of expanded over-the-counter access for medicines that have already gone through an approval process at the FDA and deserve serious and timely consideration so that constituents, our taxpayers, can have more easy access to the care and to the help that they need. Commissioner Califf, can you explain why we only see a small percentage of the prescription to over-the-counter switch annually, and what can we do to increase that number?
Sure, appreciate that, and also appreciate the importance to rural people, especially of having access to medications. I mean, what the regulations require is that the company that wants to make that switch has to produce the evidence that if they go to over-the-counter, that the person purchasing the product can understand the instructions and use it appropriately, and therefore doesn't need an intermediary to do the prescribing and the interaction with a person as a patient. So I would say whenever a manufacturer produces that evidence, you know, we're anxious to get it and to take action if they've got the data to support what they want to do. So it's really a matter, they actually can't just make the switch because they have to show that a consumer can actually understand the instructions and apply the medication appropriately.
Unfortunately, what we're hearing, Dr. Califf, is that for too long the switch process has been muddled by, you know, moving goalposts, challenges engaging in a dialogue with the FDA, and a culture at the FDA that seems to reward denying reviews and approvals rather than trying to get things done. But I have limited time, so I'd like to move on. Essentially, pharmaceutical companies are disclosing their inventions to the FDA years before disclosing them to the patent office, which can elongate commercial monopolies inappropriately by 10 years. Due to inconsistent filing with both the FDA and the Patent and Trademark Office by branded companies, many of the most expensive drugs on the market are artificially blocked from generic competition. Now, this leads to billions of dollars in lost savings to patients and to taxpayers. President Biden released a pharmaceutical competition executive order that encouraged the FDA and the Patent Trade Office to collaborate on this issue, and FDA has also conducted listening sessions where the issue was apparently discussed extensively. However, there seems to be no recent progress on this front. So what real solutions is FDA, in fact, considering to address this problem, and when can we expect to receive an update?
Well, we'd be happy to give your staff an update any day. I disagree with the view there's no progress being made. There's a very active collaboration with the Patent Office in an effort to reduce the number of inappropriate patents that get in there and block the generic competition. So we can give you an update on what's happened with that. We had a long discussion about this earlier this afternoon, but let me just say that the Patent Office has the primary responsibility for determining if there's something unique that merits a patent. That's not an FDA call. You're correct that we see the pipeline of what's coming from pharma. That's commercial confidential information that by law we can't release to anyone else. But what we want to do is make sure that there's good communication so the Patent Office understands when it's actually a valid new patent that would extend that protection from competition.
Okay, thanks. In my remaining time, I really want to switch gears here. According to the American Academy of Pediatrics, numerous studies have linked a range of health issues with the consumption of plant-based beverages by children. Furthermore, there is considerable confusion and misinformation about the substitution of non-dairy products for cow's milk. The FDA itself determined that based on 13,000 public comments, quote, consumers do not understand the nutritional differences between milk and plant-based milk alternatives. So, Commissioner, can you comment on the FDA's efforts to enforce dairy product standards of identity, particularly the use of the term milk, and the actions your agency is taking to mitigate the risks posed by the chronic mislabeling of non-dairy products using established dairy terms?
Well, I'm glad you referred to the nutritional content because that is the primary deficit here, and we are requiring that nutritional information be prominently displayed as part of the effort. What we're not doing is specifying exactly what can be called milk because this is, how do I say it, the cow's out of the barn already. It's been decades that terminology has been used, and whenever those kinds of issues, when we make a rule to require it be called something when it's been different, we've lost those cases in court. But what I think is really important is when people purchase something, they actually understand the nutritional content, and that is heavily emphasized in what we're currently putting forth.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you answering my questions. And, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.